When the worst blizzard in Toronto history hit hours before Whitney Houston's sold-out concert, everyone thought the show was canceled. But Whitney had a different plan that shocked the entire city. Before you hear this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments if you've ever been to a concert during extreme weather. March 15th, 1993. Toronto was about to witness something that had never happened before in concert history. Whitney Houston was scheduled to perform at the SkyDome for 50,000 fans, but Mother Nature had other plans. The weather forecast that morning called for light snow. By noon, it had escalated to a severe weather warning. By 3 p.m., Toronto was facing what meteorologists would later call the storm of the century. Whitney was staying at the Royal York Hotel downtown, just a 15-minute drive from the SkyDome under normal conditions. But these weren't normal conditions. She woke up that afternoon to the sound of howling wind that seemed to shake the entire building. When she pulled back the curtains of her penthouse suite, she couldn't see anything but white. "Ma'am, we need to talk," said her tour manager, David Roberts, as he burst through the hotel room door. His hair was covered in snow, his face red from the bitter cold. "The city's shutting down, Pearson Airport is closed, the highways are impassable. We're talking about winds up to 70 miles per hour and visibility near zero." Whitney walked to the window, pressing her hand against the cold glass. Down below, she could see cars abandoned in snowdrifts that had formed in minutes. The streets looked like something out of an apocalypse movie. But what David said next would test everything Whitney believed about her responsibility to her fans. "Whitney, there are already 15,000 people at the SkyDome," David continued, shaking snow from his jacket. "They started lining up this morning before the storm hit. The venue staff can't get them to leave. They're camping out in the concourses, sharing blankets and food. Some of these people drove hundreds of miles just to see you." The image of fans huddled in a cold stadium, waiting for her, hit Whitney like a physical blow. She'd built her entire career on connecting with people, on being there when they needed her voice, her presence, her heart. Now thousands of people were literally freezing, waiting for her to show up. But the conversation was far from over. At 4 p.m., Whitney's phone rang. It was her mother, Sissy Houston, calling from New Jersey with panic in her voice. "Whitney Elizabeth, don't you dare think about going out in that storm." Sissy's voice was sharp with worry. "I'm watching the news. They're calling it a once-in-a-century blizzard. Cars are getting buried. People are dying out there." This was the moment that would define not just that night, but Whitney's entire understanding of what it meant to be an artist. She looked out at the storm that was literally reshaping the Toronto skyline with snow, then at David, who was frantically making phone calls to the venue, then at her assistant Sarah, who was monitoring the local news reports that were getting more dire by the hour. "How many people made it to the SkyDome?" Whitney asked quietly. "The last count we got was about 15,000, but that was an hour ago," David replied. "The venue wants to make an announcement canceling the show. They're worried about liability, about people getting hurt trying to get home in this weather." Whitney was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the storm was getting worse. The wind was so loud it sounded like a freight train. The hotel's power had flickered twice in the past hour. This was clearly a situation where any reasonable person would cancel, reschedule, and apologize later. She thought about her childhood in New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, where her mother Sissy had taught her that commitment to others was sacred. "When people count on you, Whitney," her mother's voice echoed in her memory, "you don't let them down just because it gets hard." She thought about all the concerts she'd attended as a young girl, the way she'd felt when an artist truly showed up for their audience, and the disappointment she'd witnessed when performers seemed to phone it in. But Whitney Houston had never been accused of being reasonable when it came to her fans. "David," she said finally, her voice carrying that tone that everyone who worked with her had learned to recognize. It was the voice she used when her mind was made up and nothing would change it. "Get me a route to the SkyDome." "Whitney, there is no route. The roads are completely impassable. Even if we could get a car through the snow, which we can't, the police have cordoned off most of downtown. They're not letting anyone drive anywhere unless it's a life or death emergency." Whitney looked out the window again. In the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow, she could see the dome shape of the SkyDome rising through the storm like some kind of beacon. It was maybe 8 blocks away. Under normal circumstances, it would be a pleasant walk through downtown Toronto. Today it looked like a trek across Antarctica. "Then we walk," Whitney said simply. The room went completely silent. Sarah dropped the phone she'd been holding. David stared at Whitney like she'd just announced she was planning to fly to the moon. "Whitney, you cannot be serious. It's minus 20 degrees out there with the wind chill. The snow is 3 feet deep in some places. You could literally freeze to death before you make it 2 blocks." But Whitney was already moving toward her suitcase, pulling out the warmest clothes she'd packed: a heavy coat, winter boots, gloves, a hat. As she started getting dressed for what everyone else in the room thought was a suicide mission, she began explaining her reasoning. "Those people didn't have to come out in this storm," she said, pulling on thermal underwear. "They chose to. They made the decision that seeing me perform was worth risking their safety, worth battling through the worst weather Toronto has seen in decades. Some of them probably spent money they didn't have on tickets. Some of them probably drove through dangerous conditions to get there." She paused, looking around the room at the faces of her team, who were watching her prepare for what they were certain would be a disaster. "I became a singer to connect with people, to touch their hearts, to be there when they need music in their lives. If I won't walk 8 blocks through snow to honor that connection, then what the hell am I doing this for?" The next hour was unlike anything anyone in Whitney's entourage had ever experienced. David spent 40 minutes on the phone with Toronto police, trying to get clearance for what he kept calling an insane plan to walk through a blizzard. The venue management was frantically trying to reach Whitney to convince her to officially cancel the show. But Whitney was focused on one thing: getting ready for the most challenging journey to a concert stage in music history. At 6 p.m., just 2 hours before the scheduled showtime, Whitney Houston stepped out of the Royal York Hotel into the worst blizzard Toronto had seen in over a century. The cold hit her face like a slap. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked her over. Snow was falling so hard that she couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her. She was accompanied by David, Sarah, and 2 bodyguards who'd insisted on coming along, despite their conviction that this was the worst idea in entertainment history. They also had a police escort, 2 officers who'd volunteered to guide them through the abandoned streets, though they'd made it clear they thought Whitney had lost her mind. "Ma'am, we can turn back any time," Officer Martinez shouted over the wind as they started making their way down Front Street. "No one would blame you for canceling tonight." Whitney just smiled, pulled her hat down tighter, and kept walking. The journey took nearly 2 hours. What should have been a 15-minute walk became an epic battle against nature. They had to stop every few blocks to warm up in whatever buildings they could find that still had power. A Tim Hortons that had somehow stayed open, a hotel lobby, a 24-hour diner where the staff couldn't believe that Whitney Houston had just walked in from the storm. But the most incredible part of the journey wasn't the physical challenge. It was what they saw along the way. Despite the dangerous conditions, despite the city's warnings to stay indoors, despite the fact that visibility was nearly zero, people were still trying to make it to the concert. They passed a group of teenagers who'd been walking for 3 hours through the storm, carrying a sign that read, "Whitney, we love you," in both English and French. One of them, a 17-year-old named Marie, told Whitney through chattering teeth that she'd saved for 8 months to buy her ticket and wasn't about to let a little snow stop her now. They helped a family whose car had gotten stuck in a snowdrift just 6 blocks from the venue. The parents had driven down from Ottawa with their 2 daughters for what was supposed to be a special mother-daughter night. The youngest daughter, maybe 10 years old, looked up at Whitney with snow-covered eyelashes and said, "My mom said your voice could melt this snow if you wanted it to." Whitney laughed despite the freezing cold, thinking that maybe the little girl wasn't entirely wrong. "Are you really going to perform tonight?" the mother asked Whitney, tears freezing on her cheeks. "We thought for sure it would be canceled." "Honey," Whitney replied, helping push their car out of the snow, "I didn't walk through this storm just to turn around and go home." When Whitney finally arrived at the SkyDome at 8:15 p.m., 15 minutes after the scheduled start time, she looked like she'd been through a war. Her hair was soaked, her makeup was completely gone, and her clothes were covered in snow and ice. But she was smiling. The venue staff couldn't believe what they were seeing. Word had spread through the building that Whitney was actually attempting to make it to the show, but most people assumed it was just a rumor. When she walked through the backstage entrance, shaking snow off her coat, the entire crew broke into spontaneous applause. "How many people made it?" Whitney asked, still catching her breath from the brutal journey. The answer shocked everyone in the room. Despite the blizzard, despite the city shutting down, despite travel conditions that were being described as life-threatening on every news channel, nearly 15,000 fans had made it to the SkyDome. They'd come on foot, on skis, some had even been pulled on sleds by friends. They'd been waiting in the cold building for hours, sharing food and blankets, singing Whitney's songs to keep their spirits up. When Whitney walked out onto that stage at 8:30 p.m., the roar that greeted her was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. These weren't just fans cheering for a celebrity. These were 15,000 people who had battled through the storm of the century, who had refused to let extreme weather keep them from seeing their favorite artist, and who were now face to face with a performer who had done the exact same thing to be there for them. "Toronto!" Whitney shouted into the microphone, her voice echoing through the partially filled but intensely passionate crowd. "They said this show was canceled. They said nobody would be crazy enough to come out in this storm." She paused, looking out at the faces of people who'd wrapped themselves in blankets, who were still shaking snow out of their hair, who had made extraordinary sacrifices to be there. "But look at us. We're all crazy enough. We're all here." What happened next became the stuff of legend. Whitney performed for nearly 3 hours, longer than any scheduled concert she'd ever done. She sang every hit, every fan favorite, every song that people had requested by shouting from the audience. The show became intimate in a way that stadium concerts never are. With only 15,000 people in a space designed for 50,000, it felt like Whitney was performing in someone's living room. Between songs, she would walk to different sections of the stage, making eye contact with individual fans, many of whom were still wrapped in the blankets they'd brought to survive the wait in the cold building. During "I Wanna Dance with Somebody," she noticed a couple in the front row who were dancing together despite the man being on crutches. He'd apparently injured himself earlier that day slipping on ice while trying to get to the venue, but refused to miss the show. She told stories between songs about the journey to get there. She brought fans up on stage to warm up by the stage lights. During Greatest Love of All, she had the entire audience singing along so loudly that she stopped performing and just listened, tears streaming down her face. The acoustics in the partially filled dome created an almost cathedral-like resonance that made every voice blend together in perfect harmony. "I've performed for crowds 3 times this size," she said during the instrumental break, "but I have never ever felt more connected to an audience. You all came through a blizzard for music. For me, that's the kind of love that changes a person's whole life." The concert ended at nearly midnight with Whitney leading the entire crowd in an a cappella version of "I Will Always Love You." No instruments, no backing track, just 15,000 voices joining together in harmony in a mostly empty stadium while the worst blizzard in Toronto history raged outside. As the final notes faded, Whitney stood completely still on the stage for nearly 30 seconds, overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment. Many fans in the audience were crying, not just from the beauty of the song, but from the realization that they had all been part of something truly extraordinary. Some later said it felt like a religious experience, a moment when music transcended everything else and became pure human connection. But the story didn't end when the last note was sung. The video footage of that concert, shot on handheld cameras by fans and crew members, became one of the most treasured pieces of Whitney Houston history. Bootleg recordings of the show are still traded among fans as one of the most emotionally powerful performances of her entire career. More importantly, the story of Whitney's walk through the blizzard became part of Toronto folklore. Local news stations still replay footage of her trudging through the snow every time there's a major winter storm. The Royal York Hotel has a plaque in their lobby commemorating the night Whitney Houston walked 8 blocks through a blizzard to keep a promise to her fans. The Storm Concert, as fans came to call it, changed how Whitney thought about performing and how her audiences thought about her. She'd proven that her connection to her fans wasn't just professional, it was personal, it was real, and it was strong enough to overcome literally any obstacle. 5 years later, when Whitney returned to Toronto for another concert, the first thing she said to the sold-out crowd was, "Well, at least it's not snowing tonight." The crowd erupted in laughter and applause, remembering the night their city was shut down by nature. But music found a way. That blizzard was supposed to cancel Whitney Houston's concert. Instead, it created one of the most beautiful stories in music history, about an artist who refused to let anything, including the worst storm in a century, keep her from the people who loved her music. Sometimes the most memorable performances happen not despite the obstacles, but because of them. If this incredible story of dedication and love moved you, make sure to subscribe for more amazing tales from music history, and let me know in the comments. Have you ever braved extreme weather to see your favorite artist perform? Whitney Houston walked through a blizzard for her fans, and that night in Toronto, 15,000 people discovered what it truly means when an artist says the show must go on.